Okay, now that we've looked at narratives and how narratives are structured around the plot structure and how the author is using that plot structure to emphasize certain things, we next want to do the same thing with epistles. And we want to think through how were letters arranged and how did the authors use sentences in particular to be able to emphasize certain things. In order to do that, I want my friend Byron Strong to walk us through kind of how to do a structural layout to be able to see what God's doing in a particular text.
Hello, welcome back to Structure. I want to show you a little skill that you can use, certainly adapt to make it your own. It's something that we call structural layouts. Structural layouts are simply a way of taking a sentence and breaking it up into its little parts so that you can see how some of those parts relate to the whole. And it is useful, especially when you're working in epistles or letters. Whenever I study a letter, it's one of the first things I do with a passage or a chapter or the book. It's helpful for speeches. It can be helpful for sections of teaching. It's not quite so helpful for poetry or for narrative. So if you're going to be studying the Psalms or the prophets or some history book or the Gospels, probably not going to help you out with a lot of it. But again, it's really useful for some things that are written really more like paragraph form. So let me show you how it works. I'll just demonstrate this with a couple sentences and then we'll see the finished product, and I'll point out a couple things about why I like using structural layouts. Take where you left off with your subject verb. That's a great little exercise or skill to keep using. But you're going to take what you have here and you're just going to, in a way, analyze it a little bit more. So the first thing I do is I take the whole thing, I make sure everything's landscaped, and I will make sure I have this little indented artificial margin right here, and I'll show you why. Okay. Ultimately, what we're going to do is have what's grammatically central to each sentence here on the left, and we'll have stuff that's more tertiary make its way out here to the right. Okay, and you'll see what I mean. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take each sentence and we'll break it up into phrases or clauses. And the easiest thing to do is just to, let me get rid of all these extra spaces. Easiest thing to do is to just look for punctuation. So commas, semicolons, dashes, those kinds of things. Find those and then just hit enter. And what we're doing is taking this one sentence and breaking it up into more pieces. You can do that with other sentences. Let's just do this one for now. Okay. The other thing, the next step you want to do once you do that is you want to get these connectors or conjunctions, whatever you want to call them, all the way out here over on the left. So we're going to have all our subject and verbs line up here, but all these connectors are going to get like bumped out over to here. Okay. These connectors are really helpful for seeing how sentences relate to each other, how sentences flow or reference what comes before them. Okay, so here is a subject verb that you found for the first sentence, and it actually happens twice. Then we have these other phrases or clauses that follow underneath. And what you want to do, let me just pull down this little chart that I made a couple minutes ago. We'll just do that for now. What you want to do is take these phrases and you want to use them. You want to see what it is that they're actually telling you more about. So if we take this first one, this first phrase here, a clause, says, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision. All that's happening here is Paul is telling you who the Gentiles are. The Gentiles are the people who were called, let me move this out of the way, who are called the uncircumcised by those people who are the circumcised. Okay? we're going to keep doing that. So we take this next phrase, and this next phrase begins with which. And if you come to this little chart that I just made, which actually tells you more about a noun. So the easiest thing to do when you're doing this is to just look for another noun and work backwards. But sometimes you can work forward, but usually you're working backwards. And the nearest noun that we have is circumcision. So let's just see what happens when we duck this underneath it. Oops. Okay, so we have this statement here, remember, and this is the content of what Paul wants them to remember, that at one time you were Gentiles, and the Gentiles, if you want to just like figure out more about what it means to be a Gentile, he basically tells you here. I'm just going to move that way. The Gentile is basically the uncircumcised, and they are called the uncircumcised by the people who understand themselves to be circumcision. But circumcision, as we get from this phrase, is something that is made in the flesh by hands. Okay? So that's all we've done. Now, if we keep on going, this right here is our other main subject and verb, so we're just going to leave it right there. Actually, let's do this. Let's get rid of this little thing and put that right there. And just back this up a little. Okay, so we simply put phrases underneath what it is that they tell us more about, elaborate, or modify. Okay, now we have another phrase here. So here is the main subject, remember, and it seems like Paul's just picking up his last thought. They're supposed to remember that one time they were separated. And then it looks like the next thing is alienated. And you can kind of tell that Paul is coming up with this little list of things that they were. So they were separated from Christ, they were alienated, and then we have this next phrase down here, having no hope and without God. And again, Paul is simply taking who they are, and he's elaborating, categorizing, and saying more. If you wanted to, you could actually see that this phrase right here could get split in half, and you just have really this list of 5 things that Paul's saying they were. Remember that you were separated, alienated, strangers, having no hope without God. Okay? So when you stand back and look at this sentence, you see that, as you saw earlier, the main subject and verb is for people to remember. And it looks like the content of what they're supposed to remember, these Gentile people were supposed to remember that they were separated from Christ. Now, you could do the same thing with the rest of the sentences here. Some of these sentences, though, are pretty short and don't have commas and all these different things for you to separate and break down, but you still could do it even in a smaller way. So take verse 18, for example, or sentence 18. Here's the conjunction or the connector. We're going to push that all the way out to the left because we want those things out to the left. And then we want our subject and verb, our main subject and verb, right there on our little artificial margin. And then you can just take some of these other phrases if you want and lop them off, right? These are prepositional phrases. And prepositional phrases like this one, through him, is probably telling us something about how. How is it that people have access? Well, they have it through him. These things, prepositions, are going to modify or tell you more about verbs. So let's just put this right over this verb, have access. And you could say the same thing about in one spirit. Maybe that's like saying something about where, and where modifies a verb, tells you more about a verb. And the same thing here about the Father. So this isn't earth-shattering or anything, but you can see here the big idea is believers have access, and that happens through the Son in one spirit to the Father. And this sentence right here has its connector. So let me just finish this passage real quick, and then you can I'll make a couple more comments. All right. Okay, so this is the a finished structural layout, and this is just a skill that, again, you're able to adapt to make however you want to use. I go back and forth on some things myself, right? So I've gone back and forth on, whether or not to make this one big list or leave it like that, but it really doesn't matter. The important thing, though, is you get to see relationships. Like, you get to see this as a list. You might get to see some things that, you just didn't realize weren't as complex as you think. I mean, you look at this big, knotty sentence, and really the thing that you would have noticed with your subject-verb is that it's really about him being our peace. And yet, you get to see how this piece is broken down. There's some other things that you'll notice. Sometimes this will help you to point out little details, repeating things. You'll see some other things related to structure. It's, you'll probably, and I won't tell you, but you'll see little Trinitarian references throughout the book of Ephesians, but in this passage for sure. I do want to show you something, though, that I think is really helpful, and that is you get a feel for the whole passage by looking down this left-hand side of the page. And you can follow the conjunctions and get an even better feel for the point that the author is making, an argument that's being developed. And it's really not bad to think Paul wants them to remember that they were separated, but, right, that connects this sentence, they have been brought near. So you can see that right here with but. And then he's going to give them reasoning for why that is. He's going to give them a couple different points. And then he's going to give them further reasoning. And then he's going to tell them what this then means. So here's this big contrast. Here's like all the reasoning behind it. And he's going to say, so then. But the other thing that I think is helpful from this too is it gives you a sense of proportionality, or what's at least grammatically central. It's not to say that stuff out here on the right isn't important. It really might be theologically important, but it's not grammatically what Paul was trying to communicate in this particular passage. So, for instance, if you're in a small group study and out of the 60 minutes of your study, somebody spends 50 minutes talking about, some kind of like crazy Greek word or something like that, and they get like all technical on you, but you spend the vast majority of the time talking about this and you don't really ever get to this stuff, then no matter how cool or technical it was, it still wasn't getting at the burden of what Paul was trying to communicate. And so I think this is just a helpful thing to keep, if you're like me and you get lost in details, to keep in mind what seems to be central. And you can even determine that, not because it just sounds cool or you feel like it's important, but because you've actually dealt with the language and some of the grammar of the whole passage. Okay, so if you want to try this on your own during the class, your coach would be glad to help you, or I would too. If you're working on some of this while you're raising support after the class is over and want to run it by somebody, please feel free to reach out. I'd be glad to give you some feedback, input, and set up a call and we can talk about it. All right, take care.